Recording in progress. Welcome to Zoom members and welcome to those sitting in front of me. A wonderful turnout this evening on the longest day of the year. So thank you for coming to the last SECWAC meeting of the 2022-2023 program. We will revisit SECWAC in September. We were already working on some programs. We have some ideas for presentations on developments in Turkey, Peru. I'm working on a panel discussion on 20 years of war in Iraq, and hopefully getting a speaker on the subject of mining precious elements like cobalt in Africa and places like that. So be aware that we're working on our programs. Since this is the last meeting of the season, I want to thank a few people this evening. The Chamber of Commerce of Eastern Connecticut, and especially Rachel, who gets it organized. Who tells me not to do this? Rob Lloyd at the back, without whom the techie stuff wouldn't happen. Thanks, Rob. And the Congregational Church as a venue, and other venues we've held meetings this year, including the Essex Public Library, where we are actually currently hosting our Great Decisions program. So if you're interested in more international relations, foreign policy, contact the Essex Library and you can join in those discussions. I want to thank hardworking members of the program committee, particularly Jacqueline and Rolf here this evening, who organized the hors d'oeuvres, Robin Sedgwick, who organizes the post-meeting dinner, Noah Carver, who helps with organizing books. We don't have a book this evening. Bank Square Books and RJ Julia, who helped with the books. The SECWAC board in general. The SECWAC board is made up of all volunteers. We're always interested in more volunteers. So if you're interested in getting more involved, contact me or Chip Goodrich. Especially you, the members, without whom I would be standing here talking to an empty room. My wife would say that's no problem to Paul, but it's so much better to have an audience. And then especially also our guest speakers. You know, we've had a great season, I think, and we'll send you an email about that. I should also, let's see what else. Well, I think I'll just go straight and introduce our speaker this evening. So our speaker is Michael Oppenheimer, and the topic is hard times ahead for U.S. soft power. And I just want to point out that Michael's visit here is the result of the suggestion by a member of SECWAC, Margot Calder, who's not here, but she may be on Zoom. And this is a way of reminding you, if you know of anybody who would make a suitable speaker for SECWAC, anything in the area of international affairs, foreign policy, diplomatic history, contact me and let me know. So Michael leads the International Relations Futures concentration at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. He teaches courses on international relations, the future of international relations, and U.S. foreign policy. He also oversees an ongoing research and consulting project for the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Executive Directorate. His particular specialty is how potential future changes can be incorporated into foreign policy process in order to improve foresight and agility. His work on the future of U.S. soft power is included in a forthcoming book, Soft Power and the Future of U.S. Foreign Policy. This is literally the only advanced copy we could get our hands on that Michael got. So it's quite hot off the press, actually. And that'll be published just in June. So please give a warm welcome to Michael Oppenheimer. Thank you.
So you probably will not want to buy this book because it goes to the outrageous price of $160. I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily worth it. I just think it's a little bit excessive, frankly. But it will be available at some point electronically for less than that. So keep your eyes open if you think that you have an ongoing interest in solar power. This is the definitive current book on that subject. It's introduced by Joseph Nye, now emeritus professor at Harvard, who coined the term in the late 1980s and has written on it extensively. It's edited by Hendrik Ohnesorge, who runs a global studies program and is a professor at University of Bonn, and who will be a visiting professor at NYU next semester. So thanks, Paul, and thanks, SECWAC, and Paul, thanks for the music. This was not necessary to serenade us, my wife and I, as we arrived here. I do like Fleetwood Mac, so that timing was, just about right. My chapter in the book is entitled "Hard Times Ahead for U.S. Solar Power," which communicates essentially the message of the article, which is that in the 1990s, when the study of U.S. solar power became important, essential in all IR graduate school syllabi, again promoted by Joe Nye, with a growing body of sort of acolytes following Joe Nye and supporting its work. But times change. And the first point I want to make about solar power is that the idea is contextual, as all ideas are contextual, right? So not surprising that late 1980s into the 1990s, this period of extraordinary American power, people refer to it still as the unipolar moments, unipolarity meaning the U.S. is the dominant state in world affairs, moments meaning that it was transitory. But a period of extraordinary relative American power in the aftermath of the implosion of the Soviet Union and its empire and of communism. And this amazing sense of exceptionalism, of American exceptionalism. The sense among solar power advocates that we won the Cold War, in part because of our hard power, but also in part because of our virtue. We were the white winners, we were the good guys. Not only did we triumph geopolitically, but we triumphed ideologically. Our ideas were better, our political organization was better, our economy was more robust. We were more globalization friendly, not surprising, given that we were in effect the authors of globalization. So this was a nice message, wasn't it? And people loved it, especially foreign policy liberal thinkers. Right? The realists said, don't be foolish, it wasn't anything, didn't have anything to do with solar power, it was all hard power. Many realists sort of looking at this narrative. And it's not just you and I, it's Francis Fukuyama writing about the end of history and so forth. The realists kind of had an innate skepticism about this. To realists, there's a long history. It goes back, centuries. And lots of changes in the balance of power during that period. Lots of periods that individual states thought they were irreversibly in charge of the global system, only to fall prey to their own excesses internally as well as externally. So to a realist, the end of the Cold War was a kind of a blip. All right, it was a moment in history when the U.S. emerged as triumphant, and in the process of emerging triumphant, would inevitably seal its own fate. It would overreach. It would confuse this geopolitical victory with superior institutions. Right? It would become kind of narcissistic about its power. It would over promote, and it would invite resistance from other states who suddenly would not feel safe in the presence of this large power that was not only powerful economically, politically, militarily, but also saw itself as having a mission to reform the world and make the world more like itself. So that was the realist view. Realists turned out to be right. The soft power advocates turned out to be wrong, mostly wrong. I'm sympathetic with the idea, the soft power idea, that power is not only the size of the military or your ability to deploy it, but the attractiveness of your culture, the attractiveness of your political system, the attractiveness of your social conditions that you've been able to build within your country. So there are soft power elements that contribute to a country's ability to shape the global system in a way that reinforces its interests. But the ratio of hard to soft power in explaining American influence in the world, in my view, tilts towards hard power. The next decade or so are going to be a test for that, because clearly the things that Joe Nye and others saw as the determinants of American soft power are on the wane. Strength of our democracy, resilience of our economy, our technological sophistication, the way we run our government, the way we make decisions. There's a lot going on in this country, and I don't have to lecture you on this, you all know it, that don't suggest that we deserve the kind of soft power, the kind of influence in the world that the soft power advocates think we do or have. And that in the article, what I describe as the supply side of soft power is diminishing. And I'll get into the reasons why in a moment, but so just to introduce this concept, it was a powerful concept, and it was a concept that was a pretty good fit to the circumstances in which that idea arose and became popular. But as many sort of dominant ideas do, it outlived, the reality. And yet those who advocate it, those who have built careers on it, tend to want to perpetuate it. That's not my job in this book. It'll be very interesting, by the way, when this group of authors, there are about a dozen of us, end up going on the road, because I haven't met collectively with them yet. We all wrote our chapters individually. And in reading through the book, most of the chapters take a much more optimistic view of American soft power, a much more liberal view of American soft power. So we haven't had this fight yet, but I kind of suspect we're going to. It's very interesting to see when we're out there pushing the book, whether this sounds like a book or just a collection of disparate and conflicting ideas about soft power. My chapter comes first, so that's good, right? I mean, at least those sort of readers will get a dose of realism before they dig into the other stuff. So, there are the two elements to soft power. There's the soft part, culture, language, admiration for your political system, all kinds of institutions, the effective sports, the effective the American university system, all these activities in this very, very dense kind of civil society that represents the United States. These are all sources of soft power, all things that others are either admiring of or imitating, or in many cases participating in, right? LAV golf, if I can mention that dirty word. So these are soft in the sense that they're non-coercive. They operate on other states and on other populations through this process of kind of osmosis, through their admiration for the way we run our lives. You can see the effect of American culture all over the world. So there's no question about the way the American way of living has spread. The curious thing about that is that it hasn't translated consistently into power, which is the other part of the equation, right? So for soft culture, et cetera, to have power, you have to demonstrate that another country acted differently in the presence of that power than it would have otherwise. In other words, that through persuasion, through learning, through participation in the American system, governments, even perhaps unconsciously, pursued policies that were in your interest. That's the power part. The soft power I get, although, as I said a moment ago, the supply of that soft power coming out of the United States is truncated. It's not as robust as it used to be. The power part is the problem. Is that it's very hard to prove that a given state took a given action because of its admiration for you. And there's kind of I have diminishing confidence that states who do bandwagon with the United States are doing so out of admiration as opposed to simply their interests. Why did Finland join NATO? Did they join NATO because they admire our way of life, or did they join NATO because they're appropriately afraid of Russia and Russian behavior and see NATO as the essential key to their future security? Finland didn't want to join NATO. Finland's enjoyed its neutrality for many years, as has Sweden. So it was a real switch. And the switch began, by the way, with Finnish public opinion. It didn't begin with the government itself. It was an upwelling of Finnish popular support for NATO membership. And that has to do with security. It obviously is not a sudden kind of overwhelming sense of admiration for the American system. Not in the year, 2022, 2023. So anyway, so two elements of the definition of soft power. It is, as I said, closely connected to liberal foreign policy advocacy. I'm a liberal myself, by the way, so I'm not criticizing liberals. The word is often used as a dirty word by conservatives. It's not to me. It's liberal means a set of ideas. And you can be a liberal in internal politics, which I am, and you can be a realist in international politics, which I am, right? Because the two domains are fundamentally different in the way they operate. But the soft power sort of narrative is one of the key points of advocacy among foreign policy liberals, and what they're saying by emphasizing soft power is, look, America, you gotta fix your problems. You gotta devote more resources to your own society, your own economy. You can't become over-reliant on hard power because that leads to previous mistakes, invasion of Iraq, Vietnam, lots of mistakes. In which you exaggerated your hard power and exaggerated your legitimacy, and then discovered that other states weren't interested in what you were offering. When I was asked to do this article, I immediately kind of jumped at the opportunity because it looked like an idea whose time had come and gone. And I thought that a kind of a deconstruction of soft power, a reevaluation of soft power was something that needed to be done. And by putting it in a book, with Joe and I, it was just going to get the visibility that it wouldn't have if I written an article and published it in the journal. A lot of soft power advocates are going to read this, and their stomachs may turn, but they may learn something in the process. Several kind of mindset kind of ideas about. Oh my God. We'll just leave it there. It's okay. Don't. Begin with the understanding that ideas have power, right? That ideas enable powerful institutions, individuals, political parties, governments to expand their power. If you can convince another country to buy into your ideas, okay, it's not hard power, it's soft power. But you've done something that force can't do, right? You get them to act in admiration or in imitation of the way you organize yourself, because you've made the case, because their systems aren't working very well and they can see that yours is. They may get a certain amount of encouragement in terms of, bilateral development assistance or membership in international institutions, for which you're a kind of a gatekeeper. So there is a certain amount of well, I would call it hard power or coercion, but a certain amount of encouragement or inducements. But ideas are powerful. And that goes with the idea of soft power. My ears immediately sort of prick up. Well, now here's an interesting, kind of an idea that has been used quite consciously by American public diplomacy to encourage others to sort of imitate our own actions. The world is changing very rapidly. We've heard this before, so I won't go into why, but this is a dramatically changed landscape from the environment in which this idea originated. So, there's a red flag that goes up, right? Here's a legacy idea that no longer matches what we observe happening in the world. And yet it continues to be invoked, right? So again, it's a good example of how these ideas are deliberately used as instruments of power, but they don't always work. In fact, increasingly, this idea of kind of liberal globalization, open markets, and so forth, hasn't worked for the world, and it hasn't really worked very well for us either. So again, a value in kind of reevaluating the concept, and to see what we can do with it, to see if it still applies. I happen to think that soft power exists. I mentioned several sources of soft power earlier, but I think the parameters of soft power have changed. And if there's a mission that I have in writing this piece, it's to sort of detach soft power from its American-centric liberal origins, and to define parameters of soft power that apply to several countries in the world who are very different from each other. That will ultimately, if I can do that, enable us to do legitimate objective comparisons of soft power across regimes that are very different, from totalitarian regimes to liberal regimes. I think in a sense, in order to rescue the concept from its American-centric origins, you have to kind of step outside that exceptionalist narrative that the original soft power ideas represented, and think about, well, what does it take to survive in this very turbulent, disruptive, rapidly changing world? What are the attributes of governance? Are they resilience? Are they agility? The ability to grow your economy, making good decisions, having good intelligence. And it's not to imply that the U.S. doesn't have some of those attributes, but some of them, sort of are pretty thin in the United States. And if you look at the performance of China, you have to start thinking about, well, how much soft power does China have? China's very, very soft power, and quite deliberately uses it in extending its influence throughout Asia and into the global South. So I should take a look at the time, because I do sometimes tend to run on. How much time do I have?
Well, we're done at 7, but we can do Q&A as long as you like.
Yeah, well, you don't want me to go to 7. Yeah.
10 or 15.
10 or 15 more. Okay. The original soft power argument sort of has identify several sources of American soft power. In no particular order, the educational system, which at the university level is second to none. We have the best universities in the world. And students from all over the world flock to those universities. My classes at NYU were 25 to 30% or so students from abroad. And that's true throughout the university. And NYU and many other universities have themselves globalized, set up campuses all over the world. So American universities are global actors, and they attract a large number of foreign students who provide revenue. It's very nice, and also make the classroom much more interesting, add to the educational value of the school. Do they spread American values? It's hard to say, hard to measure it, right? I don't deliberately try to propagate American values in my classes, but is there some process of osmosis of spending 4 years in the middle of Manhattan, or more likely out in Brooklyn, but they go to classes in Manhattan? Is there something about that experience that transmits American culture, American values, and ultimately American power? Not sure about that, especially when it comes to China. Which has sent many students to NYU and many other campuses as well. I think some of them are on a kind of a short leash, and I'm not sure that they have the freedom of thought, the freedom of action that a normal American university student would have. But in any event, universities are one of the crown jewels of the American culture, high culture, low culture, a mix of both. And again, as I said earlier, just because everyone's eating McDonald's hamburgers doesn't make them friends of America. But some people see it that way. Some people believe that indirectly and over time, the more American products, American movies, American television shows, and so forth are ingested, the more influence indirectly the U.S. has on that body of people. Robust economy. Obviously a source of hard power, because that's where the tax money comes from to build weapon systems and field armies and so forth. But also it's a source of admiration, or at least potentially so, if you can maintain growth, and you can do so through shocks to the system. So you can demonstrate the resilience of your economy through effective economic governance. If you're an inventive economy, if you're a competitive economy globally, and if you figure out how to distribute the gains from economic growth in some equitable way, which, by the way, we haven't done clearly, we're going in the opposite direction. But those are potential sources of influence that, again, don't directly connect to hard power. The quality of decisions that you make, okay, are terribly important, because as the most important global power, the decisions you make influence everyone, either directly or indirectly. Are they good decisions? Are they well considered? Are they based on a reasonable assessment of your own power? Did they make the world better? And I think, the U.S. record here is kind of a mixed bag. I mean, some of the decisions we made are extraordinarily effective and foresighted. The whole construction of the post-World War II, global system is an American invention. No one else, no potential winner of World War II would ever have done it the way we did, would ever have exercised their power the way we did, in building a multilateral system of strong institutions and open economies. Let's admit this. I mean, it had a great run, even during the Cold War. It maintained relative peace among great powers. It generated enormous prosperity out of the ashes of World War II. It was why China grew at double-digit, levels, because China joined that globalization system that the U.S. invented. Good job, but not all the time. Related to that is the quality of your decision-making system. this is another liberal idea, that because the American decision system is more or less open, transparent, you can see it working, you can track the ideas that are being debated in policy circles. You can actually participate through your embassy and through your NGOs and so forth in that debate. You are not just a recipient of what the U.S. chooses to dish out. You're potentially a shaper of American policy. The French thought they could shape our policy towards Iraq. They didn't. It was a moment of truth, I think, for the Europeans when Bush, walked away from the Security Council and invaded Iraq without any approval or even oversight or input from our European allies. So, the record on policy process is kind of mixed. But there's not as much guesswork going on among foreign countries and where the U.S. is headed than there is with respect to Putin, for example, who can do whatever he wants, uninhibited by the press, by opposition elements, by civil society, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what he wants. And he just happens to own the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. So that's, all you have to know about present dangers in the world are those two facts. So there is something to be said about a process that is contested, oppositional, public, debates ideas, looks for the best answer, doesn't always find it, but it's always looking for it. And if you make a mistake, you pay, right? You pay a political price. There's an election in 4 years or less. You have to answer to the public. Putin's been in office for over 20 years. So enough said. All right, so this decision process in foreign policy, but also in domestic policy, is subject to pushback and to reevaluation and to change. The democratic advantage. Well, I mean, this is a core source of what the soft power advocates talk about. That we have a built-in advantage in soft power because our system embodies universal values. Everybody wants to be free, right? That it is in this hierarchy of needs, right? That people have freedom, security, belonging, etc. Right? That freedom dominates. It doesn't always dominate. It doesn't dominate in every country. But over time, there's a predisposition on the part of foreign publics, even if they're living in thoroughly authoritarian regimes, to look to America for hope. Okay, this is the position. I'm not advocating it. All right, but it is a core element in the soft power arguments that the U.S. has a built-in, all right, soft power advantage over other states. And then, of course, in addition to influencing foreign publics, soft power involves influencing foreign governments directly through public diplomacy, through diplomatic pressure, which does not amount to the threat of use of force, which would qualify as hard power, but to appealing directly to elites and to government actors in other countries that were able to persuade them to do things that they'd rather not do. Is that true? Well, I think it probably is true. Europe is suddenly, Germany, good example, spending or trying to spend 2% of its GNP on defense. It's something that we've been after them to do for a long time. They finally yielded to that pressure. Now, obviously, the fact that they have yielded to that pressure has a lot to do with what the Russians are up to in Ukraine. But we laid the groundwork for that. And so, it is possible through effective diplomacy to have direct impact on governments. The soft power element of that is this thing called trust. And it's also a soft power kind of phenomenon that your allies are more likely to remain allies if they trust you. Part of which is the opportunity to participate in decision-making, which I mentioned earlier. You're less likely to surprise them. Again, Bush being the exception. But over time, you can, if you're a foreign country and you're keeping your eyes on what's going on in this country, you can usually see what's coming. And you can usually influence that through what liberals call voice opportunities. You go to the Congress, you go to the governors, you go to the president's cabinet, and so forth. And sometimes you can dissuade us from doing foolish things. Those are the various sources of soft power. My view, kind of now looking towards the future, is that you've got both and the model that I applied to this is a kind of a very simple supply-demand model. You've got a supply model because your country's not working very well, right? If anyone wants to contest that, please feel free. But everything from gun violence to political dysfunction to one of our major parties having been captured by falsehoods and unable to think its way out of that trap that it's, I think it is a trap for the Republican Party, but they can't release the trap. I don't know why, but they can't do it. To our longer term erosion of quality of life, particularly in areas that were industrial areas that were the kind of the source of middle-class prosperity in the 50s and the 60s, now being hollowed out, gross levels of inequality, an increase in immobility between generations. So you can no longer say to yourself with confidence that my children will do better than me. In fact, poverty now appears to be just intransigent. It doesn't move because the educational opportunities aren't there for children that they used to be. And a myriad of other factors, which in the soft power our God makes us less attractive. It's just what it is. And it surprises me how hard it's been to get liberals to acknowledge this, because they should acknowledge it. They should see it. But they sometimes they seem more interested in democracy abroad than they do at home. It's an odd kind of an irony. But among foreign policy liberals, they're very slow to recognize how the basis for our soft power, the supply side of this, has eroded, and we can't talk our way out of it. If our public diplomacy, ignores it, it falls on deaf ears, and even becomes an instrument to be used against us with accusations of hypocrisy. So, I mean, an honest portrayal of America in the 21st century is a cautionary tale. It's not a robust, optimistic narrative that other countries should be looking to emulate. So that's the supply side. I think it's pretty easy to understand that if you're not living up to what to your best image of yourself, if you're not living up to the liberal values that soft power advocates endorse, then you've got to kind of dial back a little bit and start focusing on fixing those problems, because soft power does count for something if you can figure out how to generate it, but you're not generating it, right? So messaging your soft power it's an empty gesture at best. The demand side is a little more complicated. But if you just look at what's happening in the world, with liberal globalization as defined and promoted by the U.S., meaning open markets, democratic political systems, transparency, close collaboration through global institutions and so forth, that globalization is dying. And what's replacing it is a kind of, is an illiberal globalization, right? Where the institutions are now greatly weakened. And the instruments of globalization, trade, investment, and so forth, are being weaponized by states to do harm to their adversaries, through trade sanctions, through financial sanctions, and so forth. Suddenly, the globalization that we thought was some kind of a independently existing system, right, based on markets, has become subordinate to geopolitics. And the geopolitics is very nasty, right? As we see with Russia, as we see with China. So, you look at the world external to the US, and I suspect that even if we were to become sort of the best version of ourselves, we would still face obstacles in using our soft power to generate support for American policy. Authoritarianism is on a 15-year winning streak, according to Freedom House, a publication that records and tracks progress or lack of progress in democracy. 15 years straight, democracies are disappearing. Authoritarian regimes are appearing. Some of them thoroughgoing, some of them, with kind of, electoral autocracies, essentially, where the elections represent sort of going through the motion, but the real power is lodged in the executive. Erdogan, for example, Orban in Hungary, many other examples. The U.S., well, I don't know. We had a president who tried to overthrow his successor. So, how far are we from that? So increasing authoritarianism, weakening among historic democracies. So, your public diplomacy, even if it were, optimistic and a fair representation of who you are, would have a hell of a time getting through. Because there are a larger and larger proportion of global population that doesn't get information freely, right? That lives under the thumb of governments who manipulate or otherwise impede the flow of information into those countries. I mean, if you've done any reading on Russian popular opinion, it's quite extraordinary. They're all in with Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. So the word's not getting through. So, in kind of summarizing the demand side, you got a larger number of consequential actors. Political scientists call that multipolarity, or there's 7 poles of power as opposed to the unipolar system of the 1990s or the bipolar system of the Cold War. You've got a wide diversity in the nature of political regimes throughout the world. Some are authoritarian, some are quasi-authoritarian, some are partially democratic. I mean, the variety is extraordinary. So what we thought would happen at the end of the Cold War, which was a convergence around an American model, has not happened, obviously. And so now you're dealing with lots of regimes that are essentially homegrown, representing their own histories, their own society, their own politics. And it's harder to influence those regimes, and it's harder to get access to the people. Again, this is all premised on the optimistic internal view that you've actually solved some of these internal problems. You will still have these kinds of barriers to exerting your soft power influence. So, I'll just quickly kind of sum up kind of where I summed up the article. I think soft power is still a useful concept. I think it should be part of our equipment when we go about looking at international balances of power. That I don't think just measuring the size of armies or military budgets is an adequate way of assessing who has power. I think all these other factors weigh as well. But you've got to disengage it from that democratic bias in which it grew up, okay? And acknowledge that other systems also, answer the mail when it comes to dealing with the kind of the shocks and the disturbances and so forth of the global system. And as far as the U.S. is concerned, yeah, by all means, try to fix these things, but also get used to a world that's diverse and is not in the process of converging and will not converge around your values. Right? You still have to manage climate, disease, global economy, all these other things that we and our rivals have in common. That was what, Blinken was doing in China, or at least hopefully beginning the process of doing in China, which is just communicate. You sit down and talk about these things. And it's not a maximalist approach, right? It's a restrained approach. It's a realist approach. It's what you heard from one of your speakers, from the Quincy Institute. What's his name?
Well, Stephen Wertheim.
Stephen Wertheim. It's his point of view. But that's what you have to sort of imagine yourself doing, and you'll do quite well in that kind of environment. So we're done.
Okay, thank you, Michael. We have more for the Q&A, but I would ask please keep the questions distinct and make the questions not. And yes, if you could repeat, synopsize the question for the Zoom on.
If I hear it, I will repeat it. Otherwise, you'll repeat it. Okay.
Is economic power soft or hard?
Is it going to power what sort?
Soft or hard?
That's a great question. I didn't get into this issue of sort of how you differentiate between one and the other. There's this term called smart power, which tries to sort of integrate soft and hard. Right? It's not always clear what's how much of economics is hard and how much is soft. I think it depends on how it's used. I think if you run your economy successfully, if you generate growth and jobs and income, and if you distribute the gains from that growth in an equitable way that reinforces the political legitimacy of your system, I call that soft power. That is a legitimate source of emulation or imitation throughout the world. If, on the other hand, you use the size of your economy to sort of leverage through sanctions what other countries do, what kind of decisions they make, what kind of institutions they adopt. This is the classic kind of Washington consensus idea, that the U.S. has all the answers to how you run your economy. You privatize, you deregulate, you cut your budget, you open your borders to everything, and so forth. If that's the way your economy is used, okay, then I think it's coercive, and I think it qualifies as hard power.
Question.
Yeah, thank you for the excellent talk. So I've got a question here, question there, and I'm going to give you one question. Where we are today, what do you think the relevance of hegemonic stability theory is? That the United States was predicted back in the 1970s by a Yale professor, and then again Krasner and Weber and Krasner, that end of the 80s, they said that the leading power will be challenged by the rising power. We're seeing that now. American hard and soft power is being challenged by the Chinese. The United States, beginning actually with Romney, then through Trump, and now Biden is countering this rise in Chinese power, but only to a degree of success. So I think my question is, don't you think, given the dynamics of the world economy, that the decline of U.S. soft power is inevitable?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. As I said, I mean, I think that the external environment that I described, the power diffusion and so forth, is going to be very, very hard, if not impossible, to reverse. That's the world we're going to be living in. It's not going to be a world of convergence, of widespread adoption of the American way of doing things. So we're going to be dealing with a much more complicated environment which is more resistant to American power than the one we're accustomed to. Internally, we can fix these things. That's the liberal would be, okay. We can increase the supply of our own soft power. By doing some, frankly, and this is not designed to be partisan, but doing some of the things that Joe Biden is doing in environment and industrial policy. It's quite surprising, actually. I think Biden has surprised a lot of people in his ability to get legislation through. What looked like an absolutely deadlocked Congress. So, I mean, those are the things you can work on. And in theory, you're in control of, because you are a government, you command, your territory, you live in a safe neighborhood. You really do. I mean, compared to any other country you can think of. You have enormous resources, you have a lot going for you. And you should over time be able to figure this out. So I don't think inevitability is quite the right word to use. But you're going to be dealing with a more complex external environment for some time. So do I see hegemony in the future for the U.S.? Probably not. But still the first among equals, still prosperous, secure, admired by many states, right? At peace with yourself. Yeah, I can see that.
Here we have a question on Zoom.
Hi, Mr. Oppenheimer. This is from Sylvia Mayer.
Sylvia.
She's a friend of yours. She said, great talk, interesting and inspiring. Thank you, Michael. What role or future do you see for the European Union, specifically Germany, in the protection of democracy and the liberal international order?
Sylvia Meyer is my colleague at NYU. And I listened to her talks, and she listens to mine. We're very collegial, actually. I mean, I think it's a great question. It's interesting to speculate about what the Ukraine war will mean for the EU going forward. It's already committed itself to a fast track for Ukrainian membership in the EU. That's a pretty bold step. It'll still take a long time because Ukraine's going to have to sort of satisfy a number of very exacting criteria for membership. But the fact that the EU is looking outward, the fact that it has really met the military challenge by members increasing their own military budgets, by talking now seriously about NATO membership for Ukraine once the war is over. And I think the experience of actually being out front of the United States in providing advanced weapons to Ukraine is quite extraordinary. May produce a higher level of confidence in Europe after the war that they actually can act effectively as an autonomous global power. I mean, the contributions now are very important, as Sylvia suggests. The European Parliament just passed a bill to regulate AI. We're way behind the Europeans in figuring out how to do this. It's going to be a long process to get that approved because the Parliament doesn't decide these things and proposes these things. But in terms of setting standards in technology and in environment, in issues of income distribution, the Europeans are leading the way. So I think it's a potentially very powerful entity going forward.
Another question from the former SECWAC board.
Thank you so much. My question to you is with the gutting of the State Department, the administration during 2016 to 2020, how do you think that affects the ability of the United States to even conduct something?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, even if we had soft power, kind of a latent soft power, potential soft power, how do we communicate it? And with a, as you said, gutted State Department, do we have the public diplomacy resources to do that? You know, I'm not really current on the extent to which State Department has kind of, you know, resupplied itself. It's very strong at the top. But I don't know what the public diplomacy budget is. I don't know how many people they've hired. I think rebuilding a department like that after what Donald Trump did to it is probably a long-term process. Beginning with, you know, attracting young people to take the Foreign Service exam and commit themselves to that kind of a life. It's not an easy life. So I think, you know, kind of reviving, resupplying the department with the talent it's not a 4-year thing. And if Trump should win, you know, in the next election, it comes to a screeching halt. But you hope that, you know, over time we can rebuild that capability. Do you know the State Department? Do you have a yeah, okay. Okay.
I'm going to, we have 2 more questions, so if you can make them really succinct, that'll be great.
Yes, to what extent do you think the advances of American women over the last 50 years have contributed to American soft power or not?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, soft power cuts 2 ways. So it contributes with countries that are already sympathetic, you know, to gender equality. And it has the opposite effect on countries that aren't. You know, so you're sort of always making these diplomatically, you're making these choices. Well, you know, where do we want to promote this? And when we're promoting it, just kind of produce a negative blowback. Don't promote it with China. It doesn't, you know, don't promote it with, you know, with the Russians. You've got more important things to talk about, you know, like war and peace. And you're facing, you know, resistance. And if you're talking about that, you're not talking about, well, how do we avoid World War III? But I think you have to make these choices. But at a global level, you know, the advancement of women is an important part of the UN agenda. It's part of the OECD agenda, the EU agenda, and so forth. There's a lot of sympathy out there. And with that set of countries, I think absolutely you can promote it, and I think it is a source of soft power.
So looking in the future, where do you think these large, mega corporations like Apple, Huawei, NVIDIA play in advancing part of soft power?
What do I think?
Big companies like multinationals like Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, where will they play in?
Well, I think they've always had a role in soft power in transferring, kind of American, business practices. I think the world is becoming much more fragmented, more protectionist, more nationalistic. And I think in that kind of a playing field, which is sort of where corporate access is impeded and governments are in the way, that companies are probably going to be less important as a source of soft power. A lot of emphasis now on national firms. You've seen this in China, but you're also beginning to see it in the U.S. with the advent of an American-like industrial policy. The pressure on American firms to retrench geographically, to friend source or home source. Companies doing this themselves because they see the risk to their supply chains in places like China. So you are seeing that kind of a fragmentation of globalization, and as that happens, American firms are not going to have quite the kind of running room and the kind of influence that they used to have.
Great, thanks, Michael. Sure. We'll wrap it up at that stage. For those of you who are coming to the Oppenheimer Country Club for dinner, there'll be an opportunity for more questions. Before I ask you to thank Michael, I want to again thank you all for your support of SECWAC. We don't have the chairman, Chip Goodrich, here today, but we do have a former chairman of SECWAC, Roland Ballack. Thank you, Roland, for being here. Roland got me involved in SECWAC 10 years ago, for which I am very thankful. Chip's online. Oh, I didn't realize that. Great. Thank you, Chip. Well, the chairman is here. So, thank you all again. And Michael, thank you very much for a most enlightening presentation.
No, okay.